We are continuing our discussion of the five components of leadership, and the fifth component is our extended look at several ethical models that comprise the ethics, norms, and values in leadership. In this segment, we'll look at the social contract theory. The social contract theory is a very old approach to looking at as ethics, but for our purpose. It's also the ethical element of leader-follower relationships that we're going to be talking about throughout the course. John Stuart Mill is one of the early proponents of this and also a critic of it. And Mill his quote is probably a really good way to start by understanding and explaining what a social contract theory is about. Mill says that though society is not founded on a contract, and though no good purpose is answered by inventing a contract in order to deduce social obligations from it, everyone who receives the protection society owes a return for the benefit. And that is a good description of the social contract theory. It is really a construct. It's not a real contract. But it asserts that individual obligations of morality and participation in political life are dependent on agreements, implicitly, unwritten, unspoken, between the community and the individual to help aid in governance of society. And of course, this is just as applicable as a theory and a construct within an organization and within a community or where any kind of leadership is present. It's traced back to the ancient Greeks in much of the work of Plato and even the ideas of Socrates in Plato's work, The Crito, where Socrates refuses to break out of prison because he feels like he owes society and he feels like there's an agreement between him and society, and so the law must be obeyed and the consequences he needs to face. The more recent iterations of social contract theory come from three theorists of the Enlightenment era: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in the 20th century, in our next segment, we'll talk about John Rawls and his conception of the same social contract approach. Hobbes had a more materialistic conception of the world in his work, The Leviathan, where he very bluntly, his view of human nature was very negative. Humans, he felt like a very famous quote, "Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short," and that human beings' desire for security, basically, and for self-preservation, they are willingly give up this state of nature and live in peace under a commonwealth ruled by a strong king, a strong leader, a Leviathan, he says. So his answer to the social contract is you give everything up in order to live in peace, and the best form of this construct is a strong absolute monarch. This transfer of power is necessary to avoid self-destruction and because human beings ultimately will kill one another and will destroy everything. John Locke's conception of humanity was far different. He advocated something called the tabula rasa, or the blank slate, that this state of nature, that humans are free to pursue their own interest and they're shaped completely by their experiences. And so to safeguard freedom and private property, Locke was very concerned with private property as an expression of human freedom and justice. He felt that the government was needed only by the consent of the people as a safeguard to rights. And of course, the rights of property were paramount there. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, writing more along the lines of a revolutionary right around the French Revolution, had a totally different conception of human nature than Locke or Hobbes. He says man is born free and everywhere in chains. Society is the corrupting influence, according to Rousseau. And so he believed that the state of nature was a state of freedom and equality, that people were born in this more positive state of nature, and that society creates inequality through corrupting institutions and the right of the strongest that prevail. The social contract for him is an agreement between people in community where people agree to surrender rights. They surrender rights for the will to be a part of a moral society. So they give up their freedom for the collective general will. And that's the will of the people collectively. So we're a very communal version of the social contract, not as individual as Locke's, but more communal approach. And so there are several critics of the social contract theory. Couple questions emerge, obviously. First of all, can the contract be valid if it's not been consented to by all individual members? And again, this is a theoretical construct, so there's lots of challenges to that, but there also are things that we innately understand that we agree to as humans. And do followers have an obligation to follow leaders that don't provide the proper protections? Locke says you have the right to overthrow if the individual rights are constricted. Does the consent of the majority at the expense of individual rights? What about the minority? And so, you know, the other critique is this is a hypothetical contract. So it, you know, at what point, you know, do you allow for the subjugation of groups such as women and minorities? Do you have a contract that exists between all groups or the state collectively? So obviously there are a lot of challenges. Rawls, as we'll see in the next segment, tried to answer those challenges with a construct of his own that is a more 20th century version. But how does this affect the 5 components of leadership? And in many respects, it harkens the work that we're going to discuss from John McGregor Burns, both the transactional and transformational approach to leadership, because in many respects, the social contract is transactional. It's a transaction or an exchange between leaders, followers around a goal. Now, the question is, at what point can that transaction break down, and does it break down around the goal or between the relationship and the tensions between leaders and followers? But in organizational theory, you think about things like merit or management by objective and merit-based pay, performance appraisals. Those are all really forms of the social contract. The question is that when you get into more transformational approaches to leadership, where you get into the purpose and where you get people into buying in, I think it's still very relational to the social contract, but it takes it to a higher plane. It's not as transactional. But either way, you can see elements in our very organizational behavior on a regular basis of this concept and this ethical approach to the social contract as a construct for leaders.